Reflecting on lessons he learned from St. John Paul II's life, George Weigel wrote, quote, "The Christian who conforms his suffering to the cruciform suffering of Christ has a share in Christ's continuing redemption of the world. Thus, suffering is transformed from absurdity to mission. Thus, suffering becomes an expression of human freedom, not human bondage. Thus, suffering becomes part of the Christian life lived as a vocation." End quote. George Weigel on suffering and St. John Paul II, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture podcast from Word on Fire. George Weigel is a distinguished senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, holding the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies. A theologian, public intellectual, cultural commentator, and prolific writer, George has authored countless essays and over 30 books, including his magisterial 2-volume biography on St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope and the End and the Beginning, and his most recent work, To Sanctify the World, The Vital Legacy of Vatican II. George, it is a delight to spend this time with you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you to all the good people at Word on Fire for the extraordinary work you are doing in advancing the new evangelization, which was the great theme of the second half of the pontificate of John Paul II. And I'm sure he is interceding for you and your colleagues in this terrific enterprise.
Segment 1, Meeting George Weigel. Sir Winston Churchill passionately observed, quote, "You must sleep sometime between lunch and dinner, and no halfway measures. Take off your clothes and get into bed. That's what I always do. Don't think you'll be doing less work because you sleep during the day. That's a foolish notion held by people who have no imagination. You'll be able to accomplish more. You get 2 days in one, well, at least 1.5, I'm sure." End quote. Now, I've come to discover in a C-SPAN interview that another man agreed with the great Winston Churchill, saying of the midday nap, quote, "I think naps are a great invention, perhaps Italy's greatest contribution to human civilization," end quote. That man was George Weigel. George, considering the mountain of intellectual material that you regularly produce, is the midday nap your secret weapon?
It certainly helps, Todd. I became a nap person actually while I was in Italy a lot, in Rome a lot, in the last half of the 1990s, working on the first volume of my John Paul II biography. I would probably amend that previous statement to say that naps come a close second to Brunello di Montalcino among Italy's greatest contributions to civilization. But no, it is a good. Sir Winston was right. It's a good way to get a day and a half's work into a day. I there's a technique to this.
Mm-hmm.
It's either 25 minutes or 2 hours. Anything in between creates great mental fog.
Well,
So you got to discipline yourself.
Well, it's clear that there's not a lot of mental fog in the work you have, and again, I want to just champion your book, The Witness to Hope, or Witness to Hope, which is just extraordinary, just such a phenomenal biography and odyssey of the life of John Paul II, but especially the way you weave the theology in with the history is just tremendous. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. What I want, George, if it's okay, is I want to ask you kind of this open-ended question. How did George Weigel become George Weigel? How did somebody raised, if I'm not mistaken, on the East Coast, I think Baltimore, Maryland, if I'm not mistaken, as a young boy, as a man, and ultimately to be the person that's producing 30 books, who's spending time with popes, who's weighing in on the significant issues and events of the day in the secular and the Catholic landscape. What was the journey you went on that led you to where you are?
Todd, I actually described a lot of that in what I think of as the third volume of my John Paul II trilogy, a book called Lessons in Hope, My Unexpected Life with St. John Paul II. When the second volume, The End and the Beginning, was published, that was 5 years after John Paul's death.
Right.
And when I was around the country and indeed the world promoting that book in its various language editions, I discovered that what people really wanted was not so much more analysis, although they were grateful for that. They wanted stories,
Yeah.
stories that would bring him alive in a more personal way now that he was no longer among us physically. So I decided to write this memoir of my life with John Paul II, including a lot of material from our personal conversations that would not have fit easily into 2 volumes of scholarly biography. But I queued all of that up by trying to answer the question, how did I become the biographer of John Paul
Yeah.
II? And to cut to the chase, I think uh, it was an example of what the Pope meant when he said in Portugal on the first anniversary of the assassination attempt. He went to Fatima, as you
Hmm.
remember, on May 13th, 1982, a day after he was shot, to give thanks for his being spared. And he gets off the plane and says, in the designs of Providence, there are no mere coincidences.
Hmm.
What we perceive now as random or happenstantial or coincidental uh, is really just a facet of our lives that we haven't fit into the frame that God has created for
Right.
us. And so, as I looked back on my pre-papal life, if you will,
Yeah.
I began to see how things I had studied in college, experiences I had had professionally, which seemed good things at the time, but not connected in any particular way, were in fact providential preparations for explaining John Paul II to a world audience, uh, which is which was the task I took on. And Witness to Hope is now out in 14 languages, so
Right.
we pretty well covered the landscape here. Um, so I would, if anybody's really that interested, uh, I would have a look at Lessons in Hope. It does tell the story, and it's a kind of it becomes an autobiography as well as a story of my relationship with John Paul II. It's also got a lot of great JP2 stories. So, and written in a much lighter vein than Witness to Hope and the end.
It is a wonderful book, and I'm glad that you raised it because it is the third part, I guess, of a trilogy, and but of even more personal vein. It's interesting too, George, because one of the lines that you brought to mind in talking about your journey is the notion of this quote from, I can't remember who said it, but faith means believing in advance what only makes sense in reverse. That sometimes we can't tell in the midst of our where we are in our life, how what we are going through or what we are experiencing, what we are learning is going to pay off or help or guide us in the future until later in the future we're looking back and saying, aha. And it sounds like as you look back at your life and also as reflected in Lessons in Hope, that's the case. There's tremendous amount of experiences that were gifts of the Holy Spirit that opened the doors for you or guided or molded you in a profound way. And we are all the beneficiaries of that great journey that you've been on. So we thank you for that. Let me ask you this, George, with the diverse topics you've covered in your work, and many people think of you as clearly the biographer of John Paul II, appropriately, but ranging from the theology of John Paul II to the exquisite churches of Rome, from just war to the Cold War, from European relativists to Islamic fundamentalists. There's so much you've covered in your many books and your innumerable essays and speeches. You're one of the few in the modern era who's earned the mantle of public intellectual. And so I want to ask you, and again, we joke a little bit about the nap at the very beginning, but what is your habit of reading and your discipline that surrounds your writing? For many of our writers out there and our bibliophiles out there, they love to hear how people like you, how do you read and how do you write? Do you have a pattern? Do you have a habit? What does that look like?
Todd, for almost 40 years now, I have done columns for the Catholic press. Uh, there are probably close to 2,000 of these things right now. So that business, which began, I think, in 1979. So what is, yeah, that's something, yeah, that's 40 years plus.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that the weekly column is a stern mistress, or if you prefer, it's a beast that has to be fed on a regular
Yeah.
basis. And I think that the discipline of doing that helped get me. First of all, it helped get me out of academic ease writing,
Yeah.
which is stultifying and boring most
Right.
of the time. Um, and it opened up the possibility of doing longer form writing, essays, etc. Um, my books have been almost entirely uh, inspirations that popped into my head again in this providential way.
Mm.
I mean, this is something that needs to be addressed. Therefore, let's do it. Two of my books, the jihadism book and the Cube in the
Mm.
Cathedral, grew out of lectures I do every year here in Washington, the William E. Simon lectures. Um, Others of my books are collections of essays. But the supreme example of the almost serendipitous quality of all this is Witness to Hope.
Yeah.
I mean, I had no idea at the beginning of 1995 that in December of that year, I would be sitting at John Paul II's dinner table,
Mm.
and he would agree to my idea that I would write his biography. I mean, that did not occur to me in
Yeah.
January 1995. But there was this dreadful biography of him published by a guy named Tad Schultz, old New York Times guy, that I was reading in order to review. And it was really awful. Someone said, I think it might have been Peggy Steinfeld, wrote a review of this and said, this is like a book about Michael Jordan by somebody who doesn't understand basketball. You might get a few interesting things.
Oh,
You're gonna kind of miss the
yeah.
story. And it just occurred to me in doing this, what the heck, I can do better than
Yeah.
so I have tried to live vocationally, not in career terms, but in vocational terms. I mean, the question is always, what am I supposed to be doing now?
Yeah.
And I've been fortunate in being able to order my life such that I can live that way. As for my reading habits, they are completely eclectic.
Mm.
I'm less disciplined probably than I should. I've always got a stack of 10 books on my work table
Sure.
in my study at home. I'm trying to work my way through. I've never learned the trick of scanning books,
No.
which a lot of people do, and that there's nothing dishonorable in that. But I tend to read it cover to cover if I'm going to read it. Um, uh, I do have certain disciplines. I teach in Krakow every summer.
Mm.
As you know, I've done that for 30 years.
Yep.
In a program introducing American and Central and Eastern European graduate students to Catholic social doctrine. Oddly enough, I always take a book on the American Civil War,
Mm.
which is an old longstanding interest of mine, to Krakow. During vacation in August, I always try to read one or two books of biblical theology, exegetical books. Other things I read simply because, these are books you have to read because
Right.
they're part of the ongoing conversation, debate, discourse, whatever. Um, uh, and I occasionally read novels. Dan Silva, the
Mm-hmm.
very successful spy novelist, is a friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I even helped him with the Vatican portions of a
Sure.
couple of his books. So I don't read a lot of fiction, but I do try to reread virtually all of Evil and War at least once every 10 years.
Great. Great.
So
Great.
That's probably more than you wanted to
No,
know.
no, no. I'd love to do a whole segment just on the books you're reading and how they've influenced you. Out of curiosity, when you talk about the Civil War, is it the fascination with Lincoln? Is it more of the North-South divide, the arrows and I mean the arrows on the maps, the battles that are waged? What is it about the American Civil War that's particularly of interest to you?
Well, it's the defining experience
Yeah,
of the nation, at least to date, and therefore I think to understand the very complex dynamics of
yeah,
that, which are being, literally murdered in the woke cancel culture of today,
yeah.
is important. I read both, large scale overview stuff. Uh, I started reading and then got interrupted, but I'm going to go back to it this summer. Al Guelzo's Fateful Lightning, which is an overview of the whole business, but more in terms of social history than military history. I've got a biography of Longstreet, the Confederate general, that I'm waiting to read. So I do biographical reading about the Civil War. Um, I live about 50 minutes from Gettysburg,
Oh, sure.
and I once or twice a year I go up there to commune with the ghosts and
Right.
take a look over that really quite extraordinary landscape. And I once took, interesting, I once took, actually, it was George Pell, Cardinal Pell's
Sure.
longtime secretary, Mike Casey, and his family up there when Michael was spending a sabbatical here at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And he and the family wanted to go up to Gettysburg. So we took him up there one Sunday. And we're standing at the famous copse of trees, the so-called high water mark of the South,
Mm,
the farthest that Pickett's charge got
yeah.
on July 3rd, 1863. And, we've been listening to the audio tour guide as we drove around. And we're standing there, and Michael said to me, we have nothing like this in Australia. There's just nothing like this.
Mm,
And that's true. I mean, there are very few places that you can go around the world and say, okay, here is where what we now know as this national entity
right.
was forged.
Right.
But as Jim McPherson, Al Guelzo, lots of other fine historians, Shelby Foote,
Yep.
have all said, get the Civil War is when the United States ceased to be the United States are and became the United States is.
Good. Oh, that's great.
And the kind of forge where that happened was right there, 50 miles from my house.
It's
So
extraordinary.
fascinating, yeah.
It's funny because in one of my previous podcasts, I was interviewing Gary Saul Morrison from Northwestern on Russian literature, and one of the things we were talking about was Tolstoy's perception that history doesn't happen at these large battles and clashes; it happens in these infinite bits and so on. And while Tolstoy obviously is right about the very small nuances in a book like Anna Karenina, War and Peace, it is true that in these big events on the battlefield of the Civil War, history is shaped there too, and that's kind of what you're speaking to as well. So it's fascinating. I love what you're reading, and it's just it's extraordinary. It's endlessly plumbable, so to speak. Segment 2, introducing Pope John Paul II, and in this segment, I'm speaking exactly that point you're talking about, in which you find yourself writing or about to write or volunteering to write the biography for John Paul II. And you had said about having read or written a 5,000 word review of, I think it was Tad Schultz's book, Pope John Paul II, the biography. And you puckishly named your essay, The Biography That Might Have Been. And you offered a correction, if not a gentle indictment, of errors, misapprehensions, and distortions of the life and the mission of John Paul II. And this was when, at least as I've read, you've said to, I think it's Joaquin Navarro-Valls in the Holy See Press Office, this is ridiculous. We almost have 17 years in this pontificate. The year of 2000 is getting closer, and there isn't a reliable biography of the Holy Father. You identified a little bit of your frustrations. Michael Jordan biography without understanding basketball. Why, in your eyes, was a biography on the level of Witness to Hope? Why was that so important? Why, in the absence of a biography on this man, John Paul II, did you feel this has to be written? This has to be done.
Well, to go into confessional mode here, there was nothing gentle about my review of Tad Schultz's book. I mean, I simply eviscerated,
Yeah.
and because it was awful. It was just fundamental errors about Catholic belief and practice.
Mm.
And I had said to Joaquin Navarro, when he had told me a year before that Schultz was going to do this, and they were excited about it, because Ted Schultz was born in Poland. So he had good Polish, and they thought that would help. And I said, Joaquin, a guy who wrote an admiring biography of Fidel Castro is unlikely to get John Paul II.
Right. Good one. Good one.
I think, Todd, to answer your question, the Pope himself gave the answer to that. We had dinner in March 1996 to discuss how we were going to make this work. And he was walking me out of the papal apartment and said in this musing kind of way, almost talking to himself, but speaking of other biographical efforts, they try to understand me from the outside, but I can only be understood from inside.
Wow.
Now, I knew that already, but that put it into a sentence. And of course, what he meant by that was that unless you understood his faith, his spiritual life, his intellectual life, his friendships, his struggle of vocational discernment, his experiences of the Second World War, you just weren't going to get him.
Yeah.
It had to be from the inside out.
Right.
Now, I had some formal training academically in philosophy and theology. As I said in Lessons to Hope, if anybody had told me that when I was hacking through the works of Edmund Husserl in the fall of 1972, who is indisputably one of the 5 worst writers in the history of written language, that I would be explaining Husserl and phenomenology to the world audience.
Who knew?
30 years later, who knew indeed? But that had to be done, and you had to have a book that non-specialists could engage this guy in full and understand, among other things, that every decision he made, every initiative he took, every major appointment he made, these were all done from the inside out.
Yeah.
Meaning they had been prayed over, they had been thought through. So that's why, if Witness to Hope works, it works because it is from the inside out. And that's why the book begins with an exploration of, some of the paradoxes of his life, some of the personal qualities. And then you go right into Poland and how the unique Polish experience of the 20th century shaped both his person and his ideas.
I want to.
That's the difference there.
I am a direct beneficiary of what you did with that story because I was a Catholic convert in 2010, and I was upon the passing of John Paul II, and I was in Mexico, and my wife and I were transfixed by what was happening on television and so on, and I picked up your book. And what really mesmerized me was the Rhapsodic Theatre. What mesmerized me was the youth group and the way he ministered to these young people who were discerning marriage, discerning vocations, the prayer life in a secular world, an anti-Catholic Eastern Bloc world. Also, when I think it was when he was selected as Archbishop, if I'm not mistaken, I think he cut short one of his trips, his camping trips out with these youngsters, and found a local monastery or convent and went into the chapel to pray. And they were, if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me, but if I think that he was praying for so long and so fervently that they got worried about him, went in there, and I think he was prostrate on the ground and still fervently engaged in prayer and effectively saying, "I'm not done yet." Again, that I hope I'm telling that story right. But my point is the visceral feel, the inside out explanation of who John Paul II was is what made me fall in love with him as a figure and as a pope, and ultimately was one of the gateways for me to go through into the Catholic Church. So when you said that this could be written better, you weren't kidding, because you just knocked it out of the park and transformed the narrative and many lives in the process. I really appreciate you for doing that.
Well, thank you. I think it was also important to give people an idea of Wojtyła as intellectual without boring people
Yeah.
to death. Why? Because, even 20 years into the pontificate, which is when the book was published, you still had these nitwits saying that this was a pre-modern mind.
Yeah.
And that rubbish, of course, continues today. But what I wanted to show was no, this was in fact a thoroughly modern mind with a different reading of modernity.
Yeah.
Precisely because he was grounded philosophically in Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas. But his mind did not stop in the 13th century. I mean, he was fully conversant with contemporary intellectual life. And the notion that this was a pope of some rollback or throwback just seemed to me so absurd. And I tried to show that by exposing at least the major themes of his philosophical project, which were also in a typically Wojtyłan way, deeply pastoral. He understood that the great problem of modernity is the question, who are we?
Yeah.
What is the human person? What is a man? What is man that thou art mindful of him? And of course, he came to the conclusion, both as a man of faith and as a philosopher, that if you leave the thou out of that, if you just stop the question with what Shakespeare's question, the psalmist's question, with what is man, and don't get to the thou art mindful, to miss God is to miss us. This was something he inscribed in the teaching of the Second Vatican Council when he was Archbishop of Krakow. Gaudium et Spes 22. In Jesus Christ, we meet both the truth about God and the truth about us. And if you sunder those two truths, which are mutually reinforcing, then you're going to get a really messed up humanity, which is, of course, what we see all around us.
Right.
So that's one of the other things I thought I needed to do in this inside-out approach to writing his life.
Just a quick note on that too. You put your finger on it. Both in my eyes, both John Paul II and also Benedict XVI, that sheer extraordinary intellectual apprehension of the faith and the theological philosophical underpinnings from its inception, since from the time of Christ and before. There's no question about the intellectual heft that those two figures have had. But to your other point, the pastoral notion, it just the ability to live in both worlds, to blend both worlds. It's to me, when I think about Benedict XVI, I think he's so misdiagnosed, because people think he's the Rottweiler, he's the Inquisitor, he's in his ivory tower, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, the more I read of him, the more I feel like I encounter almost evangelical, a friendship with Christ, intimacy with Christ, this personal relationship with Christ. And I just, that is such a wonderful blend that I think has carried forward from John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And again, your work has really brought that out in fullness. Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, The Suffering Saint. In 1984, the 6th year of John Paul II's pontificate, he penned the apostolic letter Salvifici Doloris, otherwise known as redemptive or salvific suffering. And in it, he wrote, quote, "Whereas the existence of the world opens the eyes of the human soul to the existence of God, to his wisdom, power, and greatness, evil and suffering seem to obscure this image, sometimes in a radical way, especially in the daily drama of so many cases of undeserved suffering and of so many faults without proper punishment," end quote. Now, George, in your essay, John Paul II, Knowing Suffering from the Inside, that you published with our spring issue of Evangelization and Culture, you noted that when asked to sum up his experience in Nazi-occupied Poland, John Paul II answered, quote, "I participated in the great experience of my contemporaries' humiliation at the hands of evil," end quote. And you also wrote about how much he knew suffering, quote, from the inside. So this is a little bit of kind of rounding out what we were just talking about in our last segment. Why, George, do you think John Paul II was so well suited to write about such suffering? And going one step further, why does the Catholic Church speak most truthfully and most eloquently to the galling problems of pain and suffering?
Salvifici Doloris was a deeply personal apostolic letter, and it grew out of a lifetime of reflecting upon, through the prism of Christocentric faith, the many experiences of suffering that Wojtyła had encountered. I mean, you just go through the list. He lost his mother before he was 9. He lost his older brother a few years after that. He spends 5 years in this living hell of a Nazi-occupied Krakow. He comes back to a Poland that, as the Poles say, lost World War II twice.
Yeah.
Because it was now occupied by these communist thugs. He gets shot in his front yard on May 13th, 1980. And then there's his role as pastor, confessor, spiritual director, and teacher. Because when he was teaching at the Catholic University of Lublin in the late 1950s, he was teaching young men and women who had lived through the Second World War, and they want to know, does any of this make any sense? How do we make any sense of the fact that our parents and grandparents were murdered, our friends were murdered, these horrible people were doing all these horrible things to us? How do we make sense of that? I think the theological root of Wojtyła's reflections on suffering and John Paul II's Salvifici Doloris is the fact that he was a kind of Carmelite at heart. Twice during the war, once during the war and once immediately after, he tried to join a Carmelite convent outside of Wadowice, his hometown. First time they told him, "We're not taking novices during the war." The second time, he was already in the clandestine seminary of Archbishop Sapieha. And Sapieha said, no, you got to finish what you started here, which was a very wise decision
Yeah,
on
right.
Sapieha's part. But Carmelite spirituality is a cruciform spirituality.
Sure.
It's built around, whether we're talking about Teresa of Avila or John of the Cross, um, it's built around the notion that the cross, that Christ on the cross, is the axis of history.
Mm.
That this is the pivotal point of really the story of all creation. And if you can plumb the depths of that, radical suffering self-gift
Mm.
in obedience to the will of God, and then that being accepted in the most radical form by Jesus being raised from the dead to a superabundant form of manifestly human life that is more than human.
Mm. Yeah.
That is, as Ratzinger put it, Benedict XVI in his book on Holy Week, a kind of evolutionary leap. The resurrected Christ.
Yeah.
We see prefigured in the story of the Transfiguration. Then suffering begins to make sense.
Mm.
Or if not make sense, it becomes transformable.
Yeah.
Now, as Pope explained in Salvifici Doloris, there's suffering in the world because there's sin in the world. But sin is also a manifestation of God's respect for our freedom.
Yeah.
So to embrace suffering by embracing Christ on the cross is to give a new depth of meaning to human freedom.
Mm.
That freedom is not simply self-assertion. It's not self-assertion at all. Its freedom is properly understood as self-gift.
Mm.
So these are all themes in that apostolic letter that are deeply countercultural.
Very much so.
Deeply countercultural. I remember when the euthanasia argument was just getting going in the mid-1990s. I was staying in Chicago with a real John Paul II disciple, Cardinal Francis George.
Sure.
He was a dear friend of mine. And he said to me, you realize we're going to spend the rest of our lives explaining to people that suffering and death are good for you. And I said, well, Francis, that's going to be a bit of a hard sell. I suppose we'll have to give it a go here. You and I are talking during Lent, Todd.
Yeah.
And that's 7 weeks every year where the church asks us to reflect upon it.
Right.
Because while Lent does inevitably lead to Easter, you don't get to Easter without Good Friday.
Right.
And this was very much part of the interior life of John Paul II, that sense that you embrace the cross in order to go to, as he said at the end, the Father's house.
When that's so wise, and yet I know it's so hard. And it was interesting because when I was preparing for our conversation here, I thought about Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, where you have Ivan challenging God's existence. Ivan, for those who haven't read The Brothers Karamazov, is the Karamazov brother who's an atheist, kind of the elitist, kind of the academic, etc. Challenges God's existence with the example of the innocent suffering of children. And I teach a class to medical students. It's all about literature. It's called The Wisdom of Literature in a Time of Plague. And we read Albert Camus' The Plague, and there's a grueling death of a child from bubonic plague, while physicians and the priest, Father Panelou, just watch helplessly beside them. I'm just curious, George, in all of your reading, but also in your proximity to John Paul II, this embracing of the cross and the suffering that one must recognize as part of life, but also to see through it to that resurrected state, the graces that transcend the suffering. When you're in the thick of it, how does somebody get to that point where you can see the resurrection, you can see the grace when you're utterly blinded by the suffering that's just, again, attacking you day in, day out. Did you get a flavor from your experience? And I know John Paul II did on a world scale with his Parkinson's and his final days and so on. But in your closeness to John Paul, in your studying of his works, in your studying of his character, what did you learn about his ability to embrace the cross and see through to the resurrection, even though the cross is just bearing down on him?
That's a very deep question, Todd, and I think it's important to emphasize in reflecting upon John Paul II and suffering that he really did suffer.
Yeah.
There's a segment in Lessons in Hope when I talk about seeing him in September of 2003, right before a big 2-hour Polish television extravaganza to mark the 25th anniversary of his election. And I saw him just before we went on the air from the Sala Clementina in the Apostolic Palace in Rome. And he was just utterly frozen because of the med cycle and Parkinson's. And to the point where he couldn't even speak to me at that moment. And I could see in his eyes him saying to me, "Look what has happened." And it was just heartrending. And I kind of lost it and had to pull myself back together because we were going on air shortly. And then, when I saw him 3 weeks later, he was back to being his usual self.
Right.
I think that has something to do with this Carmelite sense of abandonment. Jesus abbandonato, Jesus abandoned on the cross, abandons himself to the Father's will. And that's the model for us. We finally have to say, I'm not in charge. And my faith tells me, or helps me to grasp the possibility that this is not all madness and absurdity. And I had experience of this about 5 years after John Paul II died. My son-in-law, Robert Sousa, an utterly brilliant young cancer doctor, died of cancer at age 34.
I'm sorry.
And at the wake, one of his colleagues at Johns Hopkins said to me, "We just lost our next Nobel Prize."
Wow.
Rob was a man of deep faith and embraced all of that, even though he was leaving behind my daughter, his wife, and a 3-year-old son. But I had a hard time getting over that. And about a year later, I was giving a talk in Roanoke at Hollins College. And an old girlfriend of mine and her husband were living down there. And I was spending the night at their home before driving back to DC. And we're driving back to their house. And she says to me, "Are you still fighting God?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am." And she says, "You're not going to win." Which was kind of, cutting 45 chapters of the show down to one sentence here. But it kind of, she was a woman of deep spiritual heart. And it was exactly what I needed to hear. So I think that was a kind of John Paul II statement.
Yeah, it's amazing because the mystery. I mean, one of the things that brought me into Catholicism was the notion that Christ is on the cross. I remember going to my Lutheran churches and there was an empty cross, and I understand the hope and the resurrection and so on and so forth. But in the Catholic Church, there was Christ on the cross, which put before me the notion that we are not going to run away from the suffering that is involved in our Lord's existence, but also in our own. And that we're not going to give a pat answer. We're not going to tell you that this isn't mysterious, that this isn't galling, but we're gonna face it head on, and that grace is going to outlast it. And yes, we will understand this. Instead of looking through a mirror darkly, when we're face to face in the afterlife. But I think, unlike all the ideologies the world offers that wants to give pat and convenient answers to the toughest of questions, Catholicism says there is an answer. It is Christ. It is the resurrection. It is life into eternity, but the grappling with it in its entirety right now has to be remained in a bath of mystery, but suffused in faith. And I want to reinforce to those people out here who are listening that have not read your trilogy again on Witness to Hope. I think the is at the end of the beginning,
The end of
uh,
the beginning, yeah.
and the beginning, and then Lessons in Hope. It is not just a trilogy of biography. It is a theological odyssey of a sufferer. And so, for any and all of us who have suffering, and I know all of us do, it is a tour de force that should not be missed among many of George's other wonderful works. I'm going to conclude with segment 4, and that is the path ahead. Ray Bradbury, George, Ray Bradbury once wrote, quote, "Your intuition knows what to write, so get out of the way," end quote. So, George, I want to know, what is your intuition telling you to write about next?
Well, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, Todd, I just published a book on Vatican II.
Yep.
Why the council was necessary, what it actually taught, how it was given its authoritative interpretation by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And that's a kind of capstone of a series of books I've written on the church struggling with modernity, struggling to convert modernity. And I do not have a new book project, frankly, in mind right now. But I think the intellectual project is to continue to explicate and defend the legacy of John Paul II, which is now remarkably under attack. In, in, for example, in the German synodal
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
is a frontal assault on the magisterium of John Paul II.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of that going on around the world church today, including here in the United States, as I don't need to remind you or our listeners. And I'm in for the long haul on that battle, as is my good friend Bishop Barron
Yeah.
and a mighty host of others. We are not intimidated by woke Catholicism. We are not impressed by Catholic light, as I've been calling it for 20 plus years. And we should all have figured out by now that Catholic light inevitably leads to Catholic zero.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
like the
Well said.
Coca-Cola company.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm focused on right now. I will be in Rome in October 20 of this year, October 2023, for this synod on synodality. Bishop Barron and I will be working together there. And we will be lifting up, among many other things, these themes in the magisterium and the personal witness of John Paul II that we've been discussing here.
I think everybody who has a chance to plumb, again, so many of your books and your essays, there's an evergreen quality to everything because you're speaking about issues pertaining to eternity. Also, when you're speaking about ideology and the way the Catholic Church rebuts ideology, it could be written in 1980, it could be written in 1995, it could be written in 2023. It's very, very enduring in its wisdom. So again, everybody should plumb the many, many works that you have put out. Also, I do want to say, I hope that the Word on Fire publishing team just heard that George Weigel has potentially a vacancy that should be hotly pursued by the Word on Fire publishing entity. So be careful, George, because your phone might start ringing off the hook. Even though I know you have many other calls coming to you for your writing skills and gifts. George, to wind down, two last questions. One of my favorite things to do in this podcast is ask people what they are reading right now and what 2 or 3 books they recommend everybody should read. So can you enlighten us on that?
Well, this is going to sound really cheesy, Todd, but I am actually reading Bishop Barron's book on the Old Testament.
Oh, great. We love it. I love it.
Election, freedom, holiness.
Yes.
It's really a fine piece of work. What else is on the list right now? Reading a very good book by Will Imboden called The Peacemaker. it's a
Ronald
story of
Reagan, right?
Reagan's
Yeah,
foreign policy.
sure.
And I, had an extremely tangential role in one piece of that having to do with religious freedom issues in
Mm,
the Soviet Union. So I'm very interested in that. It's a fine piece of work. I'm disciplining myself not to dive into this Longstreet biography. I'm saving that for the summer. Um, so there are any number of things I'm plowing through right now. I just finished a dreadful book called "The Second Most Powerful Man in the World:
mm,
The Life of Admiral William Leahy, FDR's chief of staff."
sure.
I forced myself to read it to see if it could keep getting worse. I mean,
And it sounds like it delivered.
it delivered. I mean, it's just an appallingly bad book. I mean, Leahy was a very interesting guy, but this is not good good
So
stuff.
this is like the Tad Schultz book on JP2. This is the Alehi version of that.
Yeah, well, and I've also been I also have right on the top of my list another. This is going to sound like the word on fire advertising
Please,
something.
please go ahead. We
Uh,
welcome it.
Matt Levering's
Oh
book
yeah.
on Newman on
Yeah,
doctrinalism.
yeah.
Matthew is as good as it
Yeah.
gets. And, these are very important issues to understand today.
That's wonderful.
So that's what's going on at the moment.
Fantastic. Finally, George, last question. How have you been personally changed by the work that you do? You look back, and I know Lessons in Hope will have people go to that the third in the trilogy on John Paul II and a more personalized version of that story. But when you reflect here in March, or in 2023, when you reflect on this, what is your sense about how you have personally been transformed in this journey you've been on, pertaining to your faith?
I'm asked that often, as you can imagine, Todd, and my immediate snarky answer is, well, absent all of that, I'd even be worse.
It's an Evelyn Waugh-esque type of response, right?
Yes,
Oh.
madam, what was his line? Madam, without the faith, I could scarcely be human.
By the way, I love the fact that, I mean, I read a lot of PG Woodhouse as well. I don't know if you're a
Yeah,
Woodhouse,
yeah. Oh, of course.
and so Waugh and Woodhouse is sort of like whenever I need a palate cleansing, and it just is fantastic. So I'm glad that. By the way, outside of Brideshead Revisit, which everybody always cites, what is your favorite Waugh book?
Um, you know, as a technical matter, I think Handful of Dust
Sure.
is probably the best thing he ever wrote. But I really like, and I'll probably reread again because I got some flying coming up during Lent.
Yeah.
This little book, Helen,
Oh yeah.
which it's kind of an experimental novel. It's almost postmodern in its sensibility, but it's outrageously funny at several points. And it is also a very profound reflection on the meaning of the incarnation. And that Christianity is not just a story, it's about stuff and stuff happening
Mm.
at a certain time, place. I also love the Sword of Honor trilogy,
Yes.
which I
Wonderful.
think they're the greatest books to come out of the second book.
Wonderful.
They are deeply theological, as I've written in a number of places. Woodhouse is just great fun.
Yeah.
I mean, as Waugh said of Woodhouse, he creates this completely implausible world and makes us believe it's
Yeah,
real.
absolutely.
And over 40 years of books, nobody ages, everybody's the same as ever.
Yep.
It's really quite an extraordinary accomplishment.
Yeah,
Uh,
everybody should read Woodhouse and Waugh. By the way, Mr. Crouchback, just throwing it back to you on the Sword of Honor trilogy. Guy Crouchback's father is just one of my favorite, small minor characters in that trilogy. It's just it's a delight. I'm glad.
Well, I actually cite several sections of that in the book Roman Pilgrimage,
Oh yeah,
the station
sure,
churches,
sure.
which is in my daily meditation on the scripture readings of Mass and the Divine Office for that day. And actually, I think it was just the end of the first week of Lent. There's a couple of citations from Guy Crouchback's reflections at his father's funeral,
Yeah,
and the spiritual problem of acedia,
yeah.
spiritual boredom. Quite great stuff. I mean, that was, I have to ask how I was changed. I mean, if I had not spent all that time in Rome doing Witness to Hope in the end of the beginning, I would not have had the idea of turning the station church pilgrimage, a great Roman tradition going back to the early first millennium, that has been resurrected by the North American College,
Mm,
into a book.
yeah.
And that has given me a much deeper appreciation of Lent and the liturgy of Lent and the interplay of scripture and the liturgy than I had ever had before. So there's one way I'm a bit better for all.
And by the way, that one, in reading that one, again, all of your works are dead, obviously labors of love, but there seemed to be a special. It struck me that book in particular had a special place in your heart, at least the way it was presented. It was a little bit of a love letter to these churches and so on. But I that's a wonderful, wonderful book as well. Again, wide array of readings to choose from George Weigel. You can't go wrong on with any of them. So, well, George. Again, George Weigel, Catholic theologian, author, and public intellectual. Thank you. It has been a pleasure talking with you. I hope we can bring you back again and talk about any number of things under the sun.
I look forward to that, Todd. Thank you. And thank you again to Word on Fire for being the exemplary new evangelization effort in the United States.
So I've been thinking. It is one thing to admit that we each must embrace our own cross. It's quite another to do it. Reflecting on George Weigel's penetrating insights into the mind and soul of St. John Paul II, I turned to Weigel's masterwork of biography, Witness to Hope. Within those pages, I came a bit closer to comprehending how John Paul II, a man whose mother died from kidney failure when he was a mere child, whose father succumbed to a heart attack during the Nazi occupation of Poland, who endured oppression in post-war communist Poland, who experienced many hardships during his religious life, and who ultimately was crippled by the ravages of Parkinson's disease, how this man learned to embrace the cross. First, from his earliest days as a priest, John Paul II accompanied others in their pain. The youth who spent time with Father Wojtyła, as he was originally known, said that he had a permanent openness. Explaining further, one youth said, "We felt completely free with him, without any burden. His presence led us to express ourselves. While he was among us, we felt that everything was all right. We felt that we could discuss any problems with him. We could talk about absolutely anything." End quote. He was profoundly intentional, a masterful listener. No matter the subject, they said, he was always interested. And this was not an attempt by the young priest to be overly familiar with the youth, but rather to offer love, wisdom, and a model for how they should in fact be to one another. One youngster said, quote, "Today, too many priests try to be like the kids. We were trying to be like him," end quote. Second, John Paul II was a man of intense prayer. When Father Wojtyła was informed by the Warsaw's cardinal that he had been appointed by the Pope to become titular bishop of Ombi and auxiliary bishop of Krakow, the young man excused himself and headed straight to the Ursuline convent in Warsaw. There, the sisters, who only recognized a young man in a cassock, opened the chapel for him to pray in solitude. When he wasn't emerging after quite some time, the worried nuns opened the door and found Wojtyła prostrate on the ground in front of the tabernacle. Hours later, he was still in the same position, and when the nuns invited him to supper, he answered, "Please let me stay here. I have a lot to talk about with the Lord." And finally, John Paul II was a man of transcendent vision. As a figure devoted to Christ as well as the cultural and literary patrimony of Poland, his life was suffused with the true, the good, and the beautiful. Frustrated with sacrilegious ideology and dehumanizing bureaucracy, he forever championed the brilliant, inextinguishable divine spark found deep within human clay. The schemers and connivers of Poland's ruling communist apparatus celebrated and scoffed at this silly and they hoped malleable man when he was elevated as Archbishop of Krakow. Even Cardinal Wyszynski wasn't sure what to make of his choice. "He is a poet," the cardinal muttered. Indeed, it was this Catholic priest-poet who helped tear down the Iron Curtain and sow the seeds of Christ's love on what was once Europe's fallow ground. Now, before I go, I want to make one recommendation for a book. Now, it's not going to come as any surprise in the heels of an interview with George Weigel and also a reflection on John Paul II, and that would be to read George Weigel's extraordinary work, Witness to Hope. It is one of the few biographies I've read that not only gives a comprehensive account of an extraordinary life, it delves deep into culture and theology so as to make the mind and the faith of John Paul II extraordinarily palpable. It lets us know a little bit of the strains of debates and discussions going on within the church at the time, but it doesn't leave things at the level of policy and politics on the world stage. It dives deep into what it means to have an intimate relationship with Christ, and especially as we would see that in St. John Paul II. So if you have the chance, purchase George Weigel's Witness to Hope. You won't be dissatisfied. Thank you for listening to the Evangelization and Culture Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to Word on Fire's YouTube channel, leave a review, and share with your friends. And don't forget to get a free copy of Word on Fire's award-winning journal, Evangelization and Culture, at wordonfire.org/journal. Until next time, I'm Todd Warner. Please keep proclaiming Christ to a hungry culture.